The vast, shimmering expanse of the ocean stretches out before you, endless, mysterious, and utterly terrifying to those who first stood at its edge thousands of years ago. Yet somehow, against all odds, humanity's earliest adventurers didn't just gaze at the waves. They built boats, hoisted sails, and vanished over the horizon. What kind of courage did it take to be among the first sailors, to leave solid ground behind and trust a wooden vessel against the fury of the open sea? This isn't just a story about boats and currents, it's about the unshakable human spirit that refused to be confined by the unknown. Think about it. These pioneers had no maps, no compasses, no guarantee they'd ever return. They sailed into storms with nothing but the stars to guide them, driven by something deeper than survival. Maybe curiosity, maybe desperation, or maybe something we've long forgotten. Their journeys connected continents, sparked trade routes that shaped empires, and proved that even the mightiest ocean was no match for human ingenuity. From the Polynesians navigating by the swell of the waves to the Phoenicians mastering the Mediterranean, every culture that dared to sail wrote a new chapter in our shared history. And that's what we're uncovering today, the secrets of the first sailors who crossed oceans and changed the world forever. How did they do it? What did they discover? And why does their legacy still matter to us now? Together, we'll piece together the clues they left behind, from ancient shipwrecks to forgotten legends, revealing how these early voyages didn't just explore the world, they defined it. So join me as we set sail into the past, where every wave holds a story, and every journey began with a single, impossible question: what lies beyond the horizon? The story of humanity's first voyages begins not with grand ships or epic tales of conquest, but with something far simpler, a hollowed-out log floating on calm waters. Picture a group of people 8,000 years ago, standing on the shores of what is now the Netherlands, carving canoes from massive oak trees with nothing but stone tools. These dugout boats, some over 30 feet long, were more than just fishing vessels. They were the first passports to a wider world. Imagine the moment someone first pushed away from shore, paddling beyond the safety of familiar currents, not knowing what they'd find. Was it hunger that drove them, a shrinking supply of fish near home, or just the irresistible pull of the unknown? What's astonishing is how quickly these early experiments evolved. Along riverbanks and coastlines, from the Nile to the Yellow River, cultures independently stumbled upon the same revelation. Water wasn't a barrier, it was a highway. In the Mediterranean, reed boats carried obsidian from island to island long before the pyramids rose. In the Pacific, bamboo rafts may have ferried people between landmasses swallowed by rising seas after the last ice age. Everywhere, the pattern repeats. Where there was water, humans found a way to cross it, but leaving sight of land that required a different kind of courage. Coastal hopping was one thing. Venturing into the open ocean meant facing waves that could swallow a canoe whole, storms with no shelter, and the terrifying possibility of becoming hopelessly lost. Yet someone always went farther. Maybe it was a family fleeing conflict or traders chasing rumors of better fishing grounds. Whatever the reason, their gamble changed everything. With each voyage, knowledge grew: how to read the stars, how currents behaved, which birds meant land was near. These weren't just trips, they were the first steps in a revolution that would bind continents together. And here's the remarkable part: we're still finding traces of their journeys. Burn marks on ancient shells reveal where early sailors cooked meals on distant shores. Pollen buried in lake beds tells us when new plants arrived by boat. Even language holds clues, words for wave or paddle that spread across islands like ripples from a stone. These fragments remind us that exploration wasn't just for kings and empires. It began with ordinary people, their hands calloused from paddles, their eyes fixed on the horizon, whispering the same question we still ask today: what's out there? One of the most mind-bending questions in human history isn't just how our ancestors crossed oceans, it's why they dared to try in the first place. Take Australia, for instance. 50,000 years ago, when ice sheets locked away massive amounts of seawater and lowered ocean levels, the continent wasn't the isolated landmass we know today. But here's the catch: even at the lowest sea levels, reaching Australia meant crossing at least 60 miles of open water. That's no accident. No one drifts that far by chance on a log. Whoever made that journey had to have built something sturdy enough to carry families, supplies, and maybe even animals. A deliberate act of exploration that rewrites what we thought possible for Stone Age societies. Now contrast that with the Americas. For decades, the dominant theory was that humans walked across the Bering Land Bridge when sea levels dropped. But mounting evidence suggests another possibility: small groups hugging the coast in boats, moving southward in hops between islands and sheltered bays. Shell middens, ancient piles of discarded seafood older than any inland campsites, tell a story of people who knew how to live off the ocean's bounty. And if they could harvest mussels and crabs, why not paddle just a little farther each generation? The Pacific Northwest's kelp forests, rich with food and calm waters, would have been a highway, not a barrier. But here's where it gets fascinating. Both scenarios, Australia's bold crossing and the Americas' coastal creep, point to something bigger than survival. They reveal a pattern of calculated risk. Early humans didn't just stumble onto new lands. They observed tides, learned seasonal winds, and passed that knowledge down. In the Torres Strait between Australia and New Guinea, oral traditions still describe star paths used for navigation, memories stretching back thousands of years. And in the Mediterranean, archaeologists found obsidian from volcanic islands 60 miles offshore in settlements dating back 12,000 years. That's not trade by accident, that's trade by design. Yet the most tantalizing clues come from where we haven't looked enough: the ocean floor. Rising seas since the last ice age drowned countless coastal settlements along with their boats. But occasionally, the sea gives something back. Off the coast of Florida, divers found a butchered mastodon skull with marks matching Stone Age tools, and it's 14,000 years old, far older than the land route should allow. Could there have been boats capable of crossing the Atlantic even then? We may never know for sure, but every new discovery chips away at the idea that early humans were landlocked. What's clear is this: the first sailors didn't just cross water, they mastered it. Whether driven by curiosity, competition, or climate change, their voyages weren't just strokes of luck. They were the culmination of observation, innovation, and a refusal to let the horizon be the end of the story. And that changes everything. Because if humans could navigate vast distances with nothing but stars and swell patterns 50 millennia ago, what else did they know that we've forgotten? Among all the cultures that dared to conquer the ocean, none stand out quite like the Polynesians, masters of the Pacific, who turned an entire ocean into their highway. Picture this: a double-hulled canoe lashed together with coconut fiber, carrying families, livestock, and even breadfruit saplings across thousands of miles of open water. No compasses, no written maps, just the stars above, the waves below, and an unshakable trust in knowledge passed down through generations. While European explorers were still hugging coastlines, Polynesian navigators had already settled islands scattered across an area twice the size of the continental United States. Their secret, a navigation system so precise it feels almost like magic. They didn't just look at the stars, they memorized the rising and setting points of hundreds of them, using them as celestial road signs. But stars were only part of the story. They read the ocean itself, feeling the subtle shifts in swells that hinted at distant land. A change in wave patterns might mean an island lay just beyond the horizon, even when it was still invisible. And then there were the birds. Certain species, like the golden plover, flew out to sea at dawn to fish but always returned to land by dusk, spotting one mid-flight. That was a living compass pointing toward safety. The real marvel, though, was how they preserved this wisdom. Without writing, Polynesian navigators encoded their knowledge into chants, rhythmic, poetic verses that held clues to currents, winds, and star paths. Stick charts woven from palm ribs and shells mapped not the ocean's surface but its hidden rhythms, showing how waves bent around islands. This wasn't just wayfinding, it was a sacred science taught through years of apprenticeship. A master navigator, or PWO, could spend decades learning to sense land by the taste of the air or the behavior of clouds, and their voyages were anything but random. When Polynesians set out, they weren't just hoping to stumble upon land, they were following well-established routes, often traveling against prevailing winds to ensure a safer return. Take the settlement of Hawaii, for example. Crossing nearly 2,000 miles of open ocean required timing voyages to seasonal wind shifts and carrying enough supplies to last weeks. This wasn't luck, it was logistics. They even brought plants like taro and coconut to cultivate on new shores, proof that these were deliberate missions of colonization, not accidental drifts. Yet what's truly humbling is how much of this knowledge was nearly lost. Colonization and modernization eroded traditional practices, and by the 20th century, only a handful of elders remembered the old ways. But here's the beautiful twist. Today, there's a revival. Voyagers like the Hokula, a replica of an ancient Polynesian canoe, have retraced these epic routes using only traditional navigation, proving once and for all that these techniques weren't myths. They were triumphs of human ingenuity, born from centuries of watching, learning, and daring to sail straight into the unknown. So the next time you look at a map of the Pacific, remember, those tiny dots of land weren't just found. They were connected by the greatest navigators the world has ever seen, armed with nothing but observation, memory, and the courage to trust what they couldn't see. In a world obsessed with technology, their story whispers a timeless truth. Sometimes the most advanced tool is the human mind. Long before the Polynesians carved their paths across the Pacific, another seafaring people left their mark on the waves, the Lapita. Imagine a time 3,500 years ago, when a single pottery style began appearing on islands scattered from the coasts of Papua New Guinea all the way to Samoa. These weren't just broken shards, they were breadcrumbs tracing one of humanity's most ambitious migrations. What's astonishing is how far they traveled: over 2,000 miles of open ocean in canoes, likely no bigger than a modern fishing boat. And they didn't just sail, they brought everything with them: pigs, chickens, yams, and even the seeds of the trees they'd need to survive. This wasn't a drift. This was a deliberate, generation-spanning voyage into the unknown. But who were the Lapita? Linguists and archaeologists have pieced together clues suggesting they originated near Taiwan, speaking languages that would eventually evolve into the tongues of modern Polynesia. Their pottery tells the story best: intricate designs stamped into clay, patterns so distinct they act like a fingerprint across the Pacific. Find a shard with those telltale zigzags and dots, and you've found a Lapita village. Yet what's even more fascinating is what they left behind, or rather, what they didn't. On some islands, Lapita settlements appear suddenly, thrive for centuries and then vanish as if they were always meant to keep moving. Were they pushed out by conflict, drawn onward by rumors of richer lands, or was it something deeper, an unquenchable restlessness coded into their culture? One theory ties their expansion to the ocean itself. Unlike later Polynesians, the Lapita didn't seem to venture far into the open Pacific at first. Instead, they island-hopped along the coasts and archipelagos of the Western Pacific, always keeping land in sight. But here's the twist. Their later voyages to Fiji and beyond required crossing hundreds of miles with no visible landmarks. That shift suggests something monumental, a leap in navigational skill, or perhaps a moment when staying put became riskier than sailing into the blue. Climate records hint at rising sea levels around this time, swallowing coastal villages. Maybe the ocean wasn't just their highway, maybe it was their only escape. And then there's the mystery of their disappearance. By the time Polynesians began their great voyages, Lapita pottery had vanished from the archaeological record. But their legacy didn't fade, it transformed. Modern Pacific Islanders still carry fragments of Lapita DNA, and their languages echo the ones spoken in those ancient coastal villages. The way Polynesians roast pigs in earth ovens, the way they weave stories of ancestral voyages, these aren't just traditions. They're living memories of the people who first taught the Pacific how to connect. The Lapita remind us that exploration isn't always about conquest or glory. Sometimes it's about survival or the quiet courage to start over. They didn't just cross water, they carried their world with them, planting it anew on distant shores. And in doing so, they laid the foundations for every Pacific culture that followed, proof that even the greatest journeys begin with a single paddle stroke into the unknown. The Nile may have been the lifeblood of ancient Egypt, but the Red Sea was its gateway to a world far beyond the desert's reach. While we often picture pharaohs ruling over riverbanks, some of their most astonishing feats happened on saltwater. Take Queen Hatshepsut's legendary expedition to Punt, a voyage so monumental she carved its story into the walls of her temple at Deir el-Bahari. 5 ships, each nearly 80 feet long, laden with ebony, gold, and living mertrees, sailed south along the Red Sea coast. But this wasn't just a trade mission, it was a spectacle of power. The Egyptians returned with leopards, baboons, and heaps of fragrant incense, proof that they'd tapped into a network stretching deep into Africa. What's staggering is how advanced their shipbuilding had become. These weren't simple reed boats like those used on the Nile. To withstand the open sea, Egyptian shipwrights imported cedar planks from Lebanon, stitching them together with ropes made from papyrus and sealing the seams with resin. They even designed removable masts, a clever trick for navigating both river currents and ocean winds. Wall paintings show vessels with towering sails, rigged to catch the monsoon winds that could carry them to Punt and back. And here's the kicker, some scholars argue they might have gone farther. A few broken pottery shards found in Oman, strikingly similar to Egyptian designs, hint at trade routes possibly reaching the Arabian Peninsula or even the western edge of India. But why risk these treacherous journeys? The answer lies in what they couldn't find at home. Frankincense and myrrh, essential for temple rituals and embalming, grew only in distant lands. The Egyptians called Punt the land of the gods, not just for its wealth, but because reaching it felt like a divine quest. Yet the real marvel isn't just that they sailed, it's how they navigated. Without compasses, they likely relied on celestial markers and the stars of the Big Dipper, which they called the thigh of the bull. Coastal landmarks, bird migrations, and even the taste of seawater might have guided them. The most tantalizing clue, though, comes from an unexpected source, a shipwreck. In 2004, archaeologists diving near the Red Sea port of Wadi Gawasi's uncovered planks, ropes, and cargo boxes inscribed with the name of Amenemhat III, a pharaoh who ruled centuries before Hatshepsut. Buried in a collapsed cave were the remains of seafaring kits, coils of rope still neatly tied, oars stacked as if waiting for the next voyage. This wasn't just a one-time adventure. It was a well-organized enterprise, a maritime tradition stretching back generations. So what does this tell us? The Egyptians weren't just pyramid builders. They were explorers who saw the ocean not as a barrier, but as a bridge. Every jar of incense, every leopard brought back to Thebes, was a testament to their willingness to sail beyond the known world. And that changes how we see them, because if they could cross the Red Sea, who's to say they didn't venture farther? Maybe one day we'll find their traces on distant shores, rewriting the map of ancient exploration once again. The Phoenicians didn't just sail the Mediterranean, they rewrote its rules. Picture a bustling harbor in the ancient city of Tyre, where cedar ships, sleek as knives, were loaded with silver from Spain, ivory from Africa, and glass so vibrant it seemed to hold the sea itself. These weren't mere merchants, they were the internet of the ancient world, connecting empires from Babylon to Athens with a web of trade routes stretching thousands of miles. And their greatest trick, turning a humble sea snail into a color worth more than gold. The secret lay in the murex, a spiny mollusk that oozed a viscous liquid worthless until exposed to sunlight, when it transformed into a purple so rich it didn't fade with time. Harvesting it was a nightmare. Thousands of snails yielded just a drop of dye, and the stench of rotting shellfish clung to Phoenician coastal cities for miles. But the result, Tyrian purple, became the ultimate status symbol. Roman senators edged their togas with it. Cleopatra draped her sails in it. This wasn't just fashion, it was power distilled into color, a monopoly so tight that for centuries no one else could replicate it. Yet their real genius wasn't in dye vats, it was in navigation. While others hugged the coast, Phoenician captains ventured into the open sea, guided by the North Star, which they called the star of the ship. They sailed west beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call Gibraltar, into the terrifying Atlantic, where Greek myths warned of sea monsters and the edge of the world. According to Herodotus, Pharaoh Necho II commissioned them to attempt the unthinkable, circumnavigate Africa. If the legend holds, they sailed south for 3 years, stopping to plant crops and wait out seasons until they returned through the Red Sea, claiming the sun stood to their right as they rounded the continent's tip. Even if exaggerated, the story reveals their reputation. These were the sailors even pharaohs trusted to test the impossible. What's often overlooked is how they turned geography into strategy. Instead of conquering land, they built a network of coastal outposts: Cadiz in Spain, Carthage in North Africa, even Mogador off Morocco, each a stepping stone for trade. Their alphabet, adapted from Egyptian hieroglyphs, became the ancestor of Greek and Latin scripts, a linguistic legacy as enduring as their ships. And when the Assyrians or Babylonians threatened their homeland, they simply moved their operations westward, proving that for the Phoenicians, home wasn't a place, it was wherever the tides carried their cargo. So why does their story matter? Because they showed the ancient world that wealth wasn't just in owning territory, it was in controlling the routes between them. Their voyages laid the groundwork for every empire that followed, from Rome's grain fleets to Venice's spice trade. And perhaps most strikingly, they remind us that some of history's greatest revolutions don't come from swords or speeches, but from the quiet courage to sail toward a horizon everyone else fears. The Greeks spun tales of distant waters where the sun set in a hiss of steam and monsters lurked beyond the Pillars of Hercules. But one man dared to turn myth into fact: Pythias, an astronomer merchant from the bustling port of Massalia. Around 325 BC, when most Mediterranean sailors clung to familiar coasts, he sailed north into the frigid unknown. His account, now lost to time, described a land where the summer sun never set, likely Norway or Iceland, and seas choked with floating ice like a lung, what we now call icebergs. Even more astonishing, his calculations of latitude using the noonday sun's height were so precise, modern scholars argue he must have carried an early version of the gnomon, a sundial's shadow-casting rod. This wasn't just exploration, it was science in motion. Yet Pythias's greatest legacy might be what his journey reveals about Greek ambition. While philosophers debated whether the earth was round, sailors were already proving it with their hulls. The Greeks didn't just map the world, they tried to measure it. Eratosthenes, using reports from travelers like Pythias, calculated the planet's circumference with shocking accuracy centuries before Columbus. But here's the twist. Much of this knowledge faded because later scholars dismissed Pythias as a liar. Why? His descriptions of tidal marshes in Britain and amber-rich Baltic shores clashed with Mediterranean assumptions. It's a reminder that history often silences voices that challenge the familiar. Enter the Romans, who turned maritime trade into an empire's lifeline. Picture a Roman merchant ship, its hold stuffed with Italian wine and glass, riding the monsoon winds to India's Malabar coast. These weren't occasional trips by the 1st century CE. Over 100 Roman ships a year braved the Indian Ocean. How they harnessed the monsoon's clockwork rhythm. Greek navigator Hippalus had cracked the code: sail east with the summer winds, return west in winter. Suddenly, a voyage that once took years could be done in months. Indian pepper flooded Roman kitchens, while gemstones from Sri Lanka adorned wealthy patricians. The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a merchant's guidebook, detailed ports from Somalia to Sumatra like a trip advisor for antiquity. But the real marvel was the scale of exchange. At Arakemdu in southern India, archaeologists found Roman pottery, amphorae for wine, even a sailor's dice proof of a trading post where cultures collided. And it wasn't one-sided. Indian ships sailed west too, bringing cinnamon and peacocks to Alexandria. This was globalization's first draft, built not by conquest but by monsoon winds and merchant cunning. So why don't we talk more about these voyages? Because empires prefer land victories. Rome celebrated its legions, not its sailors. Yet without those spice routes, the empire would have crumbled faster. Pepper wasn't just seasoning, it preserved meat, masked stale flavors, and even served as currency. When Alaric the Visigoth besieged Rome in 410 CE, he demanded 3,000 pounds of pepper as ransom. That's the power of a sailor's gamble. Sometimes the quietest voyages shake history the most. The bittersweet truth, we'll never know how much was lost. Pythias's original manuscript, Roman ship logs, Hippolytus's charts all crumbled to dust, but fragments remain like whispers across millennia. A Greek coin found in Vietnam. A Tamil word for wine borrowed from Latin. These aren't just artifacts, they're proof that long before GPS or satellites, humans wove the world together with sails and stars. And that's the real story, not just who sailed farthest, but how each voyage stitched civilizations a little closer, one wave at a time. While the Mediterranean buzzed with trade and the Polynesians charted the Pacific, a different kind of sailor was carving a path across the North Atlantic's icy waters, the Vikings. Picture a longship, its dragon-headed prow slicing through frigid waves, sails straining against the wind as it ventures farther west than any European had dared. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson, son of the infamous Eric the Red, steered his crew toward a land he'd only heard of in whispers, Vinland. Lush with wild grapes and towering forests, this wasn't just another stop on a raiding trip. It was North America, reached nearly 5 centuries before Columbus stumbled upon the Caribbean. The Norse sagas, part history, part epic poem, paint a vivid picture of that first contact. Ericsson's crew built turf-walled houses at a site now known as Elance Ox Meadows in Newfoundland, where archaeologists centuries later would find iron nails, a bronze pin, and the unmistakable outline of a Viking-style forge. But the sagas also tell of something else, encounters with the indigenous people the Norse called Skraelings. At first, trade unfolded peacefully, with exchanges of milk for animal pelts. Then tensions flared, arrows flew. The sagas describe a pregnant Norse woman grabbing a sword from a fallen warrior, baring her breast and terrifying the attackers into retreat. Whether myth or memory, the message is clear. This wasn't an empty land waiting to be claimed. So why did Vinland fail? The sagas hint at a mix of factors. Distance was a killer. Greenland, their nearest settlement, was already a brutal 2-week voyage away, and Norway lay another month beyond that. Supply lines stretched impossibly thin. Then there was climate. The so-called medieval warm period that had made Greenland marginally habitable was waning, and colder winters meant shorter growing seasons. But perhaps the biggest factor was simply this: the Norse weren't prepared for a land where others already thrived. In Iceland and Greenland, they'd found empty shores. In Vineland, they were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and ultimately unwilling to pay the bloody cost of holding ground. Yet their brief foothold in North America changes how we see history. A Norse spindle wall found at Elance Ox Meadows proves women were there. This wasn't just a raiding party, but an attempt at real settlement, and that's what makes their story haunting. For a flickering moment, the Atlantic was more than a barrier. It was a bridge. Had the Norse persisted, had they adapted rather than retreated, the map of the world might look utterly different. Instead, Vinland faded into legend, a tantalizing what-if buried under centuries of silence. But here's the twist: the Norse didn't forget. Greenlanders kept sailing to Labrador for timber long after Vinland was abandoned, and Inuit oral traditions speak of encounters with pale, bearded strangers. The sagas, passed down through generations, kept the memory alive until archaeologists dusted it off in the 1960s. That's the real lesson of the Vikings in America. History isn't just written by the victors. It's written by those who refuse to let the story die, even when the world isn't ready to listen. Imagine a fleet so vast it could blot out the sea, 317 ships, some stretching 400 feet long, with 9 masts and decks piled high with porcelain, silk, and spices. This wasn't a European armada of the age of exploration. It was the Ming dynasty's treasure fleet, commanded by Admiral Zheng He, sailing the Indian Ocean nearly a century before Columbus crossed the Atlantic. While Europe was still crawling out of the Middle Ages, China's colossal junks were docking in Kenya, exchanging gifts with sultans, and returning with giraffes paraded through the streets of Nanjing as living symbols of imperial reach. Zheng He himself was as extraordinary as his voyages. Born Mahi in a Muslim family in Yunnan, he was captured as a boy by Ming forces, castrated, and thrust into service as a court eunuch. Yet through sheer brilliance, he rose to become the emperor's most trusted admiral. A diplomat, navigator, and military strategist rolled into one. His 7 epic voyages between 1405 and 1433 weren't just about trade. They were floating embassies projecting China's power without conquest. A single one of his flagships could have swallowed Columbus's Santa Maria whole, with room left for Magellan's Victoria. The logistics alone boggled the mind. Each expedition carried 28,000 crew sailors, soldiers, interpreters, even astronomers to read the stars. They repaired ships at sea, deployed advanced sternpost rudders, and used watertight bulkheads, a technology Europe wouldn't adopt for centuries. Their navigational charts, detailed in the Mao Kun map, plotted every major port from Vietnam to Mogadishu with eerie precision. And unlike European explorers who often stumbled upon lands by accident, Zheng He's fleets moved with purpose, following well-documented routes backed by generations of Arab and Chinese maritime knowledge. So why did it all stop? The answer lies in a single word: politics. When the Yongle emperor died, conservative Confucian scholars gained influence, arguing that China's wealth should be spent on defending the Great Wall, not chasing glory overseas. They saw the treasure fleets as wasteful vanity projects, never mind that the voyages had brought back silver, gems, and diplomatic alliances. By 1433, new ship construction was banned, records were destroyed, and the greatest fleet the world had ever seen was left to rot in harbor. The irony is crushing. Just as Europe stood on the brink of its age of exploration, China turned inward, dismantling the very technology that could have made it a global superpower centuries early. Had Zheng He's legacy endured, might the Indian Ocean have remained a Chinese lake? Would maps today label California as part of a Ming tributary system? We'll never know, but the next time someone claims Europe discovered the world, remember the 7 voyages that rewrote history, then were erased by it. While European ships still hugged coastlines, Arab and Indian mariners were mastering the Indian Ocean's rhythm like conductors of a symphony. Picture a D, how at sunset, its triangular lateen sail catching the monsoon wind, a design so efficient it could tack against the breeze, turning what others saw as an obstacle into an engine. These weren't just boats, they were time machines, shrinking the vast expanse between Zanzibar's spice markets and Sumatra's pepper groves into a single trading season. The secret wasn't just technology, it was timing. Sailors knew the summer monsoons would blow east to India, while winter winds would carry them home to Arabia. Nature's clockwork became their roadmap. At the heart of this system lay knowledge passed down not just through families, but in meticulous manuals like the Kitab al-Fawaid, a 12th century navigational Bible that mapped stars, currents, and even the color changes of open water. While European sailors still feared falling off the edge of the world, Arab navigators used the camel, a simple wooden rectangle tied with knots, to measure latitude by the height of Polaris. They understood the Indian Ocean's moods, how the smell of mud meant the Indus Delta was near, or how certain seabirds never flew more than 20 miles from land. This wasn't guesswork, it was science refined over generations. The scale of their trade still echoes in our language. The word monsoon comes from the Arabic mausim, meaning season, while how may trace back to Sanskrit. But the real testament is in the cargoes they carried. African ivory shipped to Cambodian temples, Maldivian cowrie shells used as currency in Bengal, and most precious of all ideas. Alongside silks and spices sailed the numerals we now call Arabic. Though they originated in India, medical texts from Baghdad's House of Wisdom and the astrolabe which would later guide European explorers. What's often overlooked is how these voyages shaped daily life. In Zanzibar, archaeologists unearthed Persian-style toilets in homes from the 11th century, while Indian betel nuts, a chewing stimulant, became status symbols in Arabian courts. The ocean wasn't just a highway, it was a cultural blender. When Ibn Battuta, the Moroccan scholar, traveled to China in the 14th century, he did so on Arab ships, hopping between ports where Swahili, Tamil, and Arabic mingled in the markets. Yet the most striking legacy might be what didn't happen. Unlike later European empires, these networks thrived without conquest. Sultans and Rajahs taxed trade, but no one tried to colonize the sources of pepper or pearls. The Dehau's genius was its flexibility, small enough to enter shallow rivers, sturdy enough for open ocean, just as the system itself adapted to monsoons, pirates, and shifting demand. That's why the story of these mariners matters. They proved the world could be connected not by force but by mutual need, and in doing so, they built an invisible web that held together half the globe long before anyone else dreamed it possible. The Basques have always been a puzzle, a people whose language shares no roots with any other in Europe, clinging to their rugged corner of the Pyrenees like a cultural fortress. But their greatest secret might not lie in the mountains. It could be hidden in the foggy waters off Newfoundland, where centuries before Columbus, Basque whalers may have chased the giants of the deep into uncharted territory. Imagine the scene: wooden chalupas bobbing beside a 30-ton right whale, harpoons flying, the air thick with the scent of boiling blubber. These weren't just fishermen, they were industrialists of the sea, turning whales into lamp oil and corset stays long before oil rigs dotted the horizon. What makes their story so compelling is what's missing. Unlike kings and explorers, the Basques kept no grand records of their voyages. Theirs was a trade built on silence, quietly cornering the European market in whale oil while rivals assumed they were hunting closer to home. But scattered clues tell another tale. In 1565, a ship's pilot named Juan de Agremont claimed Basque fishermen had been visiting a land called Terra Nova for over 100 years, which would place their arrival in the 1400s. Even more tantalizing are the whaling stations discovered at Red Bay, Labrador, where Basque artifacts, from notched counting sticks to ship's logs in Euskara, their untranslatable tongue, date back to at least the 1530s. That's decades before the first official European settlements. Then there's the DNA. Studies of modern Basque populations revealed genetic markers found in some indigenous groups along the Canadian coast, hinting at contact long before Columbus. Linguistic oddities add fuel to the fire. The Mi'kmaq word for knife, uskuj, bears a striking resemblance to the Basque Euskara, their name for their own language. Coincidence, maybe, but when you stack these fragments together, a pattern emerges. A shadowy network of transatlantic voyages erased by time, secrecy, and the sheer mundanity of fishermen keeping their best spots quiet. The real question isn't just whether they came, it's what they left behind. Basque whalers didn't build colonies or plant flags, they came for the whales and little else. Their legacy is written in bones, thousands of whale skeletons piled in Labrador's shallows, butchered with precision. Unlike later explorers, they had no interest in conquest. The land was just a place to render blubber into profit. That's why their story slips through history's cracks. Empires write records, fishermen write recipes for harpoon lines and barrel repairs. Yet their silence speaks volumes. If the Basques were indeed the first Europeans to work these waters, they redefined what exploration meant. Not a quest for glory, but a relentless pursuit of resources, one that bound continents together long before textbooks noticed. And that's the irony. History remembers those who shouted their discoveries. The Basques, whispering over cod-laden tables in harbourside taverns, might have known the truth all along. The sweet potato might seem like an odd candidate for rewriting history, but this humble tuber tells a story that spans oceans. Found thriving in Polynesia long before Europeans arrived, its genetic fingerprint traces back unmistakably to varieties cultivated in the Andes. How did a South American crop end up scattered across Pacific islands separated by thousands of miles of open water? One theory points to the wind. In 1947, Thor Heyerdahl's Kon-Tiki raft proved it was possible for currents to carry a balsa wood vessel from Peru to Polynesia. But skeptics argue that accidental drift can't explain the sweet potato's widespread presence or the Polynesian word for it, kumara, which echoes the Quechua term kayuma. Coincidence doesn't usually leave such crisp breadcrumbs. Then there are the chickens. At Chile's El Arenal archaeological site, chicken bones dating to around 1400 CE, long before Spanish contact, were found alongside fishhooks and pottery. DNA testing revealed something astonishing. These birds shared ancestry with Polynesian fowl, not European breeds. Even more telling, their bones showed cut marks matching traditional Polynesian butchering techniques. But the plot thickens. In the Marquesas Islands, archaeologists uncovered pre-Columbian traces of peanuts, another South American native, another silent witness to possible contact. The debate isn't just about plants and animals. Look at the art. Easter Island stone statues, with their elongated ears and solemn faces, bear an uncanny resemblance to carvings found in Bolivia's Tiwanaku culture. Or consider the blowgun, a weapon never independently invented in the Americas, yet suddenly appearing in Panama around the same time Polynesians were mastering the Pacific. Even linguistics hints at connections. The Mapuche people of Chile have a word for ni, koni, startlingly similar to the Polynesian turi. Yet for every clue, there's a counter-argument. Skeptics point out that sweet potato seeds could have floated across the ocean naturally, clinging to driftwood. The Chilean chicken bones possibly contaminated or misdated. And without a sunken Polynesian canoe off the coast of Peru or a South American artifact in a dated Polynesian layer, the evidence remains circumstantial. But here's what's fascinating. Modern replicas of Polynesian double-hulled canoes, like the Hoculaire, have successfully sailed from Tahiti to California using only traditional navigation, proving the voyage was technically possible. What's at stake isn't just who got where first. It's about recognizing that the pre-Columbian world might have been far more connected than we ever imagined. If Polynesians did reach the Americas, they didn't come as conquerors or colonists. They came as visitors, traders, maybe even teachers, leaving behind whispers in the dirt and in DNA. And that changes everything, because history isn't just written by those who built monuments sometimes. It's written by the wind, the waves, and the quiet persistence of a route that refused to stay put. While the Vikings dominate our image of medieval seafarers, whispers of other daring voyages linger in the shadows of history tales so persistent they refuse to fade. Take the Irish monks, scribes who traded quills for oars in flimsy currach, boats little more than animal skins stretched over wooden frames. These weren't warriors seeking plunder, but holy men fleeing worldly distractions. According to the Voyage of St. Brendan, a text dating back to the 9th century, monks may have reached Iceland as early as the 6th century, calling it the land of the frozen sea. The Norse later wrote of finding papers and bells left behind by people they called papar, a tantalizing echo of Christian hermits who'd sailed into the unknown centuries before Leif Erikson was even born. Then there's Prince Madoc, a figure woven into Welsh folklore. The story goes that in the 12th century, this disenchanted nobleman fled family strife, sailing west with a handful of ships never to return. Centuries later, European explorers along the Ohio and Mississippi rivers reported encounters with light-skinned tribes speaking Welsh-sounding words, claims later dismissed as colonial fantasy. Yet dig deeper and you'll find strange breadcrumbs. The Mandan people's circular boats resembling coracles, their fair-haired children, even a rock carving in Alabama that some insist reads Madoc in archaic Welsh script. Skeptics scoff, but legends often crystallize around kernels of truth like sea foam hardening into salt. What's revealing isn't whether these stories are fact, but why they endure. They tap into something primal, the idea that exploration wasn't the monopoly of any one culture. A monk's quest for solitude, a prince's flight from conflict, a fisherman's gamble for better waters. These motives transcend time. The ocean didn't discriminate. It offered its dangers and its gifts equally to all who dared. And that's the real lesson hidden in these fragmentary accounts. History isn't just written by those who kept records. It's whispered by those who left only riddles. Maybe St. Brendan really did spot icebergs glowing like cathedrals in the midnight sun. Perhaps Madoc's ships did founder on unfamiliar shores. What matters is that the human imagination has always sailed ahead of the map, turning empty horizons into stories waiting to be proven true. The year was 1488 when Bartholomew Diaz's battered caravels finally limped into port after 16 brutal months at sea. His crew had survived storms so violent they dubbed the southern tip of Africa the Cape of Storms, though hopeful Portuguese royalty would later rename it the Cape of Good Hope. What Diaz proved wasn't just that ships could round Africa. It was that the Indian Ocean, long dominated by Arab and Asian traders, was now within Europe's reach. And the vessel that made it possible, a deceptively simple ship called the Caravel, a hybrid so revolutionary it would change the world. At first glance, these ships seemed unremarkable, barely 100 feet long, dwarfed by Chinese junks or even Mediterranean galleys. But their genius lay in the blend. Portuguese shipwrights borrowed the triangular lateen sails from Arab dhows, allowing them to tack against the wind with uncanny agility. Then they paired it with the sturdy hulls of northern European fishing boats, creating a vessel equally at home in choppy Atlantic swells and the doldrums near the equator. Add in the sternpost rudder from Chinese designs, and you had something unprecedented, a ship that could go anywhere. Yet technology alone didn't drive these voyages. The Portuguese crown operated like a 15th-century Silicon Valley startup, pouring money into risky ventures with world-altering potential. Prince Henry the Navigator, though he rarely sailed himself, became the patron saint of exploration, funding map-makers, astronomers, and secretive schools where captains pored over stolen Arab charts. The goal wasn't just wealth, it was intelligence. Every voyage had strict orders to log currents, winds, and coastal landmarks, creating an ever-expanding database of nautical knowledge. And the risks unimaginable. Scurvy turned gums black and teeth loose. Ships vanished without trace like Diaz's own brother, lost off the coast of Guinea. But the rewards are the rewards. When Vasco da Gama finally reached India in 1498, he brought back a cargo of pepper and cinnamon worth 60 times the expedition's cost. Suddenly, the math was clear. One successful voyage could bankroll a dozen failures. What's often forgotten is how these explorations were as much about faith as finance. Portuguese caravels carried not just traders, but missionaries hoping to outflank the Muslim world by finding Christian allies in Africa and Asia. When Da Gama landed in India, his first question wasn't about spices, it was whether the locals were Christians. The disappointment when he found Hindu temples instead reveals the tangled motives of the age, gold and God forever entwined. The real legacy of these voyages, though, lies in the maps. Slowly, painstakingly, the blank spaces on Portuguese portolan charts filled in not with sea monsters or fantasy kingdoms, but with accurate coastlines and trade winds. Each returning captain added another piece to the puzzle until, by the time Columbus set sail in 1492, the world was already shrinking. The irony, he'd studied those same Portuguese maps before convincing Spain to back his westward gamble. Without Diaz's proof that oceans could be mastered, Columbus might never have dared cross his own sea of darkness. So the next time you hear Age of Discovery, don't picture lone geniuses chasing glory. Picture shipyards buzzing with borrowed ideas, kings betting kingdoms on long odds, and sailors staring at stars no European had navigated by before. The caravels didn't just change geography, they rewrote the rules of what humans believed was possible, and that's a revolution no map could ever contain. The songs of the Yolngu people echo with memories of the sea, not just as a boundary, but as a bridge. For generations, Aboriginal Australians have passed down stories of ancestral voyages to what we now call Indonesia and Papua New Guinea, trading turtle shells for obsidian and songs for stories. These aren't just myths, they're living maps encoded with tidal patterns and star paths that guided wooden rafts across the Arafura Sea. When anthropologists recorded Yolngu elders singing about the mud along the coast where the tide turns, they were stunned to realize these lyrics precisely matched the mangrove swamps of northern Australia, visible only at certain lunar phases. This wasn't folklore, it was nautical science disguised as poetry. Then there's the rock art. Along the cliffs of Arnhem Land, paintings depict Makassar praus from Sulawesi, elegant wooden ships with distinct triangular sails centuries before European contact. But the most compelling evidence lies in the genes. DNA studies reveal traces of Indian ancestry in some Aboriginal groups dating back 4,000 years, long before British colonization. How did it get there? Likely through the same maritime networks that brought dingoes to Australia 3,500 years earlier, proof that the continent was never as isolated as we once assumed. The tragedy is how much was lost. Colonial policies severed these ancient sea roads, dismissing indigenous knowledge as primitive superstition, yet fragments survive. In the Torres Strait, warriors still perform dances mimicking the movements of waves, while elders recount how ancestors navigated by reading the color shifts in clouds, a technique modern sailors now recognize as a way to spot distant lagoons. Even the word for boat in some northern languages shares roots with terms used in Timor, linguistic driftwood from an era when the ocean connected rather than divided. What's revolutionary isn't just that Aboriginal Australians sailed, it's how they remembered. Unlike European explorers who relied on parchment charts, they stored navigation in song cycles so precise, scientists have used them to reconstruct prehistoric coastlines submerged since the Ice Age. When a Yolngu elder sings of the shark that circles the reef where the fresh water meets the salt, he's pinpointing an estuary that vanished 7,000 years ago. That's not myth-making, it's geology set to melody, a library of the land written in rhythm and rhyme. So next time someone calls Australia an island continent, remember, its shores were once humming ports in a vast indigenous trade network where knowledge flowed as freely as the tides. The real discovery isn't that Aboriginal people crossed waters, it's that they never saw them as barriers to begin with. The Sahara wasn't always a sea of dunes. Stretching across Algeria's Tassili en Nadjarat plateau, prehistoric paintings show something astonishing. Boats gliding through water, surrounded by giraffes and hippos. These aren't symbolic doodles, they're snapshots of a time when rivers cut through what's now the world's largest desert. But here's the mystery. Some of these vessel drawings appear hundreds of miles from any known ancient waterway. Were they just memories of a lost paradise or proof that early sailors navigated a green Sahara? One clue lies in the Wadi Sura caves of Libya, where boat petroglyphs share uncanny similarities with Nile rivercraft. The curvature of the hulls, the placement of oars, it's as if the artist had seen Egyptian boats firsthand. Yet these images date back over 6,000 years, long before camel caravans linked the Nile to the interior. Could there have been an earlier, forgotten network of rivers or lakes allowing such cultural exchange? Satellite imaging reveals ghostly river channels buried under the sand, remnants of a time when monsoon rains turned the Sahara into a patchwork of grasslands and waterways. But another theory is even more provocative. In Mauritania's Oud Mertutek, a 30-foot-long stone boat structure sits stranded in the desert, surrounded by burial mounds. Local Tuareg legends speak of the sea people who once traveled these sands in vessels. Archaeologists are divided. Some argue it's a ceremonial monument, while others point to the presence of marine shells and fish bones in nearby Neolithic sites. The most tantalizing find, a handful of Carthaginian coins near the stone boat, hinting at trans-Saharan trade routes that might have used seasonal waterways before the desert swallowed them whole. The truth may lie in what's missing. No preserved Saharan boats have ever been found, just their echoes in art and odd stone arrangements. But consider this, the Garamantes, a desert kingdom described by Herodotus, built underground tunnels to tap fossil water, creating oases that functioned like desert ports. If they could engineer such sophisticated hydraulics, is it so hard to imagine them lashing together reeds for seasonal travel? What's certain is this: the desert's boat images aren't just random graffiti. They're fragments of a lost world where water shaped human movement as powerfully as it did along the Nile or the Tigris, and that changes everything. Because if the Sahara was once crisscrossed by sailors, then the boundaries between river civilizations and desert nomads blur into irrelevance. The sand, it seems, has been hiding more than just gold and tombs. It's been guarding the ghostly wakes of voyages no one remembers. The story of Abu Bakr II reads like something from a lost epic, a 14th-century Malian emperor who reportedly abdicated his throne, assembled 2,000 ships, and sailed into the Atlantic's unknown waters, never to be seen again. Arab historian al-Umari recorded the tale decades later, claiming the emperor's successor, Mansa Musa, spoke of the voyage during his famous pilgrimage to Mecca. If true, it would mean a West African fleet predated Columbus by nearly 200 years. But separating fact from legend is like trying to catch smoke in your hands. Dig deeper and the clues grow intriguing. Malian shipbuilders of that era crafted massive pirogues, canoes hollowed from single giant trees, some capable of carrying 80 men. Their fishermen routinely ventured far offshore, mastering currents that could theoretically carry a vessel from Senegal to Brazil in about 60 days. Then there's the testimony of Columbus himself. His logs mention encountering black traders in Panama who claimed their ancestors came from the east. Were these descendants of Abu Bakr's lost fleet, or evidence of earlier, unrecorded crossings? The plot thickens when you examine the Olmecs, the first great civilization of Mesoamerica, left behind colossal stone heads with unmistakably African features, broad noses, full lips, carved over 3,000 years ago. Mainstream archaeology attributes this to artistic stylization, but others see a fingerprint of transatlantic contact. Even more tantalizing are the nicotine and cocaine traces found in Egyptian mummies, plants native only to the Americas. Could ancient sailors have bridged the oceans without leaving written records? Yet skeptics counter with oceanography. The Atlantic's equatorial currents flow westward, but surviving the journey would require staggering luck, freshwater storage, disease prevention, and navigating storms with no coastline for refuge. And where's the physical proof? No sunken Malian ships have been found, no definitive Olmec inscriptions describing foreign visitors. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, as the saying goes. The ocean swallows secrets whole. Perhaps the most compelling argument isn't about ships at all, it's about plants. The bottle gourd, a staple crop in both Africa and the Americas, appears genetically identical on both continents by 8,000 years ago. Floating across the ocean naturally is possible, but so is human transport. Similarly, the presence of African yams in pre-Columbian Caribbean soils raises eyebrows. Coincidences pile up until they start to feel like clues. What's often overlooked is how these theories challenge our biases. History has long been written as if the Atlantic were a one-way street, Europe discovering the Americas, never the reverse. But the ocean doesn't play favorites. Currents that could carry a Norse longship to Newfoundland could just as easily propel a Mandinka pirogue to Brazil. Maybe we've been asking the wrong question all along. Instead of who crossed the Atlantic first, we should ask how many times was it crossed and by whom, without anyone back home ever knowing. The truth may lie somewhere in the fog between fact and folklore. Whether Abu Bakr's fleet reached the Americas or not, his story reminds us that curiosity and courage aren't confined to any one culture. The ocean's horizon has always whispered to adventurers, and some of those whispers might have carried farther than we ever imagined. The night sky wasn't just a canopy of light for ancient sailors, it was a celestial roadmap etched with clues only the initiated could read. Picture a Polynesian navigator lying flat on his canoe's deck, eyes locked on the horizon as a specific star, say Hoculaire, our modern Arcturus, rises directly overhead. That moment when a star passes exactly through the zenith point meant something profound. He'd reached the latitude of Tahiti. No compass, no charts, just the precise memory of which stars crowned which islands. This wasn't guesswork, it was a masterclass in astronomy encoded into oral tradition, where chance preserved star paths like lyrical GPS coordinates. Across the ocean, Arab traders refined a different tool, the camel. A simple wooden rectangle with a knotted string, it worked like a cosmic ruler. By holding one end to the teeth and stretching the string until the North Star aligned with the top edge, sailors could measure latitude by counting knots. Each knot represented a known port's position. Pull to the third knot, and you're on course for Hormuz, the seventh, Calicut. The genius lay in its portability. Unlike bulky astrolabes, the camel fit in a pocket, yet it unlocked the Indian Ocean's breadth with mathematical precision. But celestial navigation demanded more than tools. It required rewriting nature's chaos into order. The Maori of New Zealand didn't just memorize stars, they tracked the Wetu Kamoka star compass, dividing the sky into 32 houses like a celestial rose. Winds and swells were part of this map too. A shift in wave patterns under a specific constellation might signal an unseen island over the horizon. Similarly, Marshall Islanders wove stick charts from palm ribs, where curved twigs represented ocean swells bending around atolls, a tactile map of the sea's invisible contours, readable by touch in pitch-dark nights. The real marvel, how these systems coexisted without contact. While Vikings used a sunstone to polarize light through fog, the Bugis of Sulawesi navigated by the Southern Cross and Orion's belt, calling them Binturang Bola Kapang, the stars that don't move. Both cultures, oceans apart, had decoded the same sky's constants, yet secrecy often guarded this knowledge. In the Mediterranean, Phoenicians allegedly threw navigators overboard if foreign spies were aboard, ensuring their star routes stayed proprietary. What's often overlooked is the cost of error. One misremembered star or misjudged swell could doom a voyage. That's why training took decades. In the Caroline Islands, apprentices spent years blindfolded in canoes, learning to feel the ocean's pulse until they could name their position by the deck's tilt beneath them. These weren't just skills, they were survival codes, burned into memory because parchment dissolved in salt spray. Today, we've traded star compasses for satellites, but the legacy lingers. When NASA engineers needed backup navigation for the Orion spacecraft, they turned to an old trick, star tracker cameras, descendants of the camel's logic. The heavens that guided explorers out of sight of land now steer ships between planets, proof that some maps never fade, they just scale up. The ocean demanded innovation, and ancient shipwrights answered with brilliance as diverse as the cultures they hailed from. Along the Arabian coast, sailors stitched their vessels together literally. Using fibers from coconut husks or date palms, they lashed planks edge to edge, creating flexible hulls that could bend with the waves rather than snap under pressure. These sewn plank boats weren't just functional, they were self-repairing. When a storm loosened the bindings, sailors could simply re-stitch them at sea, turning vulnerability into resilience. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, Phoenician craftsmen perfected the mortise and tenon joint, a technique so sturdy it's still used in carpentry today. By carving interlocking tabs and slots into planks, then sealing them with hot pitch, they created ships rigid enough to carry tons of cargo yet sleek enough to outrun pirates. Then came the Chinese rudder, a breakthrough as transformative as the wheel. Before its invention around the 1st century CE, ships relied on steering oars, awkward paddles that required brute strength to maneuver. But the sternpost rudder, mounted vertically at the ship's rear, changed everything. By pivoting on hinges, it harnessed the water's flow to turn the vessel with precision, like a fish flicking its tail. Suddenly, ships could navigate narrow rivers and tight harbors without a crew of rowers straining at oars. This wasn't just an upgrade, it was a revolution that would eventually spread west, reshaping global maritime design. Yet no ship embodied its environment like the Viking longship, clinker-built with overlapping planks riveted together. These vessels flexed like living things in rough seas. The keel, deep and blade thin, sliced through waves while the shallow draft let them glide up beaches or frozen rivers. But the real genius lay in the details. A single square sail, woven from wool and coated in animal fat for waterproofing, could propel the ship at 15 knots, yet be lowered in minutes when stealth was needed. And those iconic dragon head prows, more than just intimidation, they were detachable, swapped for plain posts when entering friendly waters to avoid angering spirits. What united these innovations wasn't just ingenuity, but adaptation. Arabian sew-stitch boats thrived in the warm, salty waters where wood was scarce but fiber abundant. Mediterranean mortise and tenon joints catered to a sea dotted with ports for repairs. Chinese rudders excelled in crowded waterways where precision mattered. Viking flexibility conquered the North Atlantic's fury. Each design solved a problem unique to its world, proving there's no one right way to conquer the ocean, only the way that keeps you afloat long enough to tell the tale. The irony, many of these ancient techniques still outperform modern materials in surprising ways. In the 1980s, archaeologists built a replica of a 4th century BC Greek merchant ship using original methods. To their shock, the mortise and tenon joints proved more resilient against modern container ship collisions than steel hulls. Meanwhile, Polynesian double-hulled canoes, lashed with coconut fiber, have survived Pacific storms that shattered fiberglass yachts. Sometimes the old ways endure not just as history, but as quiet lessons in humility, reminders that the best technology isn't always the newest, but the one that listens to the sea. The ocean has its own invisible roads, not paved with stone, but woven from wind. For ancient sailors, mastering these aerial highways meant the difference between reaching distant ports and vanishing into the blue. Nowhere was this more evident than in the Indian Ocean, where the monsoon winds didn't just blow, they breathed on a cosmic schedule. Every summer, the landmass of Asia heated up, pulling moisture-laden air from the southwest across the ocean like a colossal inhale. Ships from Arabia to India rode this airborne river, their sails swollen with predictable power. Then, like clockwork, winter reversed the flow, sending them home on northeast winds. This wasn't just weather, it was nature's metronome setting the rhythm of trade for millennia. The genius lay in how cultures harnessed this rhythm. Arab traders called these seasonal winds mawsim, literally the time, giving us the word monsoon. But the real masters were the Gujarati merchants of Western India, who built entire economies around the wind's calendar. They'd load their dhows with spices in November, catch the northeast monsoon to Zanzibar by January, trade for African ivory and gold, then ride the returning winds home by March, just in time to sell their cargo before the heat spoiled it. Miss the window and you waited a year. No wonder ancient Indian texts compared the monsoon to a god's breath. It held the power of life and ruin in every gust. Half a world away, a different wind system rewrote history. The Atlantic's trade winds, steady easterlies born from Earth's rotation, became Europe's shortcut to the Americas. When Columbus set sail in 1492, he didn't aim straight west. He dropped south to the Canaries, where these winds could catapult him across the ocean like an arrow. Without them, his tiny fleet might have stalled in the doldrums, those windless graveyards where ships could languish for weeks. But the trades had a dark irony. They created a horrific loop for slave ships, which sailed west with human cargo, returned east with sugar and cotton, then repeated the cycle. A cruel economy built on the wind's unrelenting consistency. What's astonishing is how these wind patterns didn't just enable travel. They sculpted empires. The spice routes' wealth flowed on monsoons, making Alexandria and Calicut bustling hubs while landlocked kingdoms withered. Portugal's mastery of the Atlantic trades let it bypass Arab middlemen, funneling pepper directly to Europe and bankrupting Venice's medieval spice monopoly. Even the Pacific had its wind roads, the Spanish trades that propelled galleons from Acapulco to Manila, turning the Philippines into a crossroads for Mexican silver and Chinese silk. Yet the real test of a sailor's skill wasn't just riding the wind, it was surviving when the wind betrayed. The Indian Ocean's mawsim could arrive late or weak, stranding ships in hostile ports. And woe to the captain who misjudged the trade wind's strength, like those who missed the Caribbean and wound up marooned in Brazil. That's why the greatest navigational invention wasn't a tool, but a mindset: patience. To sail by wind was to surrender to forces beyond human control, to accept that nature's schedule outweighed king's demands. Today, we've tamed the winds with engines and GPS, but their legacy lingers in unexpected places. Modern container ships still plot courses to harness currents and seasonal winds, saving millions in fuel. And if you listen closely, the old rhythms echo on. In Oman, fishermen still speak of the al-Haf, the wind that smells of rain and ripens dates while Caribbean farmers plant crops by the trade's return. The wind roads never closed, we just forgot how to hear their whispers. But for those who dared to listen, they were the original internet connecting continents long before the first cable was laid. What drives a person to paddle past the last familiar island, knowing they might never return? The psychology of exploration isn't just about courage, it's a cocktail of traits that rewires the human mind for the unknown. Take the Polynesian navigators who memorized star paths not as dry data but as epic chants. Their mental maps weren't charts, they were stories woven with the rhythms of waves and the flight patterns of birds. This wasn't just navigation, it was the art of turning uncertainty into song. Then there's the Phoenician merchant, gripping the rail as his ship bucks through Atlantic swells beyond Gibraltar. For him, risk wasn't a leap of faith, it was calculus. He carried not just cargo, but contingency plans, alternative trade goods, alliances with coastal tribes. Even the secret of Tyrian purple, dye to barter if storms wiped out his wares. Adaptability was his compass. Where others saw empty ocean, he saw a network of what-ifs, each horizon a negotiation rather than a barrier. But here's the paradox: the greatest explorers were often the worst documentarians. Viking sagas exaggerated storms to glorify their heroes. Arab traders obscured routes to protect monopolies. Their stories weren't lies, they were survival tools. By mythologizing their journeys, they turned personal gambles into cultural imperatives. When Leif Erikson called Newfoundland Vineland, he wasn't just naming a place, he was selling a dream of fertile shores to lure future settlers. Exploration at its core is storytelling with stakes, yet beneath these grand narratives thrived quieter motivations. The Inuit who paddled kayaks into Arctic mists weren't seeking fame, they were following seals to feed their families. The Bajau sea nomads of Southeast Asia dive 40 meters on a single breath, not for glory, but because the ocean is their pantry. For them, exploration wasn't a choice, it was intimacy with necessity. This flips the script on the classic explorer archetype. Sometimes the deepest voyages spring not from wanderlust, but from the simple need to survive another season. Modern psychology reveals something startling. The brains of habitual explorers physically change. London cab drivers who memorize the city's labyrinthine streets develop enlarged hippocampi, the same region Polynesians used for star maps. Risk-takers show heightened dopamine responses, mirroring the thrill that propelled Phoenicians past the Pillars of Hercules. Even our genes hint at this legacy. The DRD47R allele, linked to curiosity and restlessness, appears most frequently in descendants of migratory populations. Exploration, it seems, isn't just a behavior. It's biology. What unites these minds across millennia isn't fearlessness, it's the ability to reframe fear. When Aboriginal Australians sang their way across invisible coastlines, or Zheng He's fleet vanished over the Indian Ocean's curve, they weren't ignoring danger. They were conversing with it, turning the unknown into something negotiable. That's the real lesson etched in their wakes. Exploration isn't about conquering the horizon. It's about learning to speak its language. The Antikythera mechanism, pulled from a Roman shipwreck in 1901, still baffles scientists today, a corroded bronze puzzle of interlocking gears that modeled planetary movements with eerie precision. Dubbed the world's first analog computer, it proves ancient sailors didn't just brave the seas, they calculated them. But here's the haunting question. If something this advanced survived by chance, how much more was lost? The ocean doesn't just swallow ships, it devours entire libraries of innovation. Take the phantom lighthouses. Roman texts mention towering beacons along the North African coast, their mirrors reflecting sunlight or fire to guide ships from 50 miles away. Yet not a single one stands today. Were they polished bronze, like the legendary mirror Archimedes used to burn enemy ships? Or perhaps early lenses like the Norse sunstones that polarized light to reveal the sun through fog? We'll never know. Their secrets crumbled with the stones. Then there's the mystery of the Chinese south-pointing chariots, described in 3rd century texts as compasses mounted on wheeled vehicles. They allegedly pointed true south no matter how the chariot turned. Some scholars argue these weren't just legends but sophisticated differential gears, mechanical ancestors to the Antikythera device, yet no intact specimen survives. Did Mongol invasions scatter their makers, or were they lost in the same imperial purges that burned Zheng He's navigation charts? Even simpler tools hint at forgotten genius. Polynesian voyagers reportedly used navigation calabashes, gourds filled with water and marked with star bearings to teach celestial paths. The few surviving examples suggest they functioned like primitive sextants, but the full technique died with the last master navigators. Similarly, Viking sun compasses, wooden discs with shadow-casting gnomon, vanished until modern replicas proved they could pinpoint latitude within 2 degrees. The greatest loss might not be gadgets, but the knowledge encoded in them. Arab sailors once navigated by the Qiyas system, calculating a ship's speed by throwing a weighted float overboard and reciting poetry lines until it passed the stern, each verse a precise time unit. This wasn't superstition, it was applied mathematics disguised as rhythm. Yet colonial-era maps dismissed such methods as primitive, erasing centuries of observation. Perhaps the most poignant vanishings are the accidental ones. In Alexandria's burning library, treatises on tides and shipbuilding turned to ash. The Carthaginians, fearing Roman spies, allegedly burned their maritime manuals before surrender, taking their Atlantic routes to the grave. Even the Antikythera mechanism's purpose remains debated. Was it for navigation, astrology, or some hybrid science we no longer recognize? That's the real tragedy. Every lost device represents a shattered link in humanity's chain of curiosity. We celebrate Columbus and Magellan, but their voyages rested on fragments of forgotten wisdom. A star chart copied from Arabic texts, a compass design smuggled from China. The ocean's greatest secret isn't what it hides beneath its waves, but how much it's made us forget. And that's why every shipwreck, every sunken cogwheel, is a puzzle waiting to rewrite history. For the Polynesian navigators, the ocean wasn't a blank expanse. It was a living map, its surface etched with invisible highways only they could read. Picture a master wayfinder standing at the prow of his canoe, bare feet pressed against the hull, feeling the subtlest shifts in the swell beneath him. A sudden change in the rhythm, a refraction where waves bent around some unseen mass, could signal an island over the horizon, long before its palm trees broke into view. This wasn't intuition, it was a science of observation so precise it bordered on poetry. They called these wave patterns T-Lapa, underwater lightning, that flickered in predictable directions, pointing the way like celestial street signs. But waves were just one thread in nature's navigational tapestry. Migrating birds became living compasses. The golden plover or collier flew out to sea at dawn to feed but always returned to land by dusk. Spotting one mid-flight meant land lay in the direction of its wings. Even the color of the clouds held clues. Pale turquoise reflections on their undersides hinted at lagoons beneath, while stationary cumulus clouds often clustered over islands, pinned there by rising warm air. The ocean itself whispered its secrets to those who knew how to listen. A sudden patch of calm water might mean a reef lurked below, while the smell of mud or vegetation carried on the wind could signal a river delta miles away. The brilliance of these methods lay in their redundancy. If clouds were obscured, navigators turned to birds. If birds were scarce, they read the waves. This wasn't guesswork, it was layered intelligence, a system refined over generations until it became second nature. Consider the Marshall Islanders' stick charts, not physical maps, but tactile representations of swell patterns. Curved palm ribs showed how waves bent around atolls while shells marked islands. A navigator would memorize the chart, then discard it, carrying the knowledge in his fingertips. At night, blindfolded apprentices learned to feel the canoe's tilt and drift, translating the ocean's pulse into mental coordinates. What's astonishing is how these techniques mirrored the environment itself, adaptive, interconnected, and resilient. While European sailors clung to coastlines, terrified of losing sight of land, Polynesians thrived in the open ocean's vastness precisely because they trusted nature's signals more than fixed landmarks. Their navigation wasn't about conquering the sea but collaborating with it, a dance of mutual understanding. Yet this knowledge wasn't infallible. Storms could scramble wave patterns, migratory birds might alter routes with shifting seasons. That's why the greatest navigators never relied on a single clue. They cross-referenced everything: the taste of the air, the star's position, even the types of debris floating past. A coconut bobbing in the current wasn't just driftwood, it was a breadcrumb trail pointing toward the nearest atoll. This holistic approach turned the entire Pacific into a familiar neighborhood, its pathways written in water, wind, and wings. The tragedy is how much of this wisdom faded when modern instruments arrived. But here's the miracle: fragments survive. Today, Hawaiian voyagers relearning these ancient techniques report something uncanny: the ocean still speaks the old language. Waves still refract around islands, birds still follow their timeless routes, and clouds still gather over lagoons. The map was never lost, we just forgot how to read it. And that's the real lesson of these environmental clues. The greatest navigation tools weren't invented. They were inherited, whispered by the world itself to those patient enough to learn. The story of Atlantis isn't just a philosopher's fable, it might be history wearing the cloak of myth. Plato's tale of a mighty island kingdom swallowed by the sea has tantalized explorers for centuries. But what if the kernel of truth lies not in the Atlantic, but in the Aegean? Around 1600 BC, the volcanic island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, erupted with a force 10 times greater than Krakatoa. The blast sent tsunamis racing across the Mediterranean, devastating the seafaring Minoans on nearby Crete. Their sophisticated palaces, vibrant frescoes, and labyrinthine cities were left in ruins, their maritime trade network shattered. To the ancient Greeks who inherited fragments of their legacy, could this catastrophe have morphed into the legend of a lost civilization punished by the gods? Look closer at the parallels. Plato described Atlantis as a circular city with concentric rings eerily similar to Thera's pre-eruption geography, where a central harbor was encircled by land. The Minoans, with their advanced plumbing and vibrant art, fit Plato's portrait of a wealthy, technologically gifted society. Even the timing aligns. Egyptian priests, whom Plato cited as his source, recorded a catastrophic event that disrupted trade with the Keftiu, likely the Minoans, around the same period. Could generations of retelling have transformed a real disaster into a moral parable about hubris? But Atlantis isn't the only flood myth hiding possible truths. The Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh recounts a great deluge sent by angry gods, mirroring the biblical Noah story. Geological evidence shows the Black Sea was once a freshwater lake until rising Mediterranean waters burst through the Bosporus around 5600 BC, flooding an area the size of Ireland. Survivors fleeing inland might have carried this trauma into oral tradition. Similarly, Aboriginal Australian tales describe coastlines swallowed by rising seas after the Ice Age, details later confirmed by underwater archaeology. The most haunting examples come from the Pacific. Maori legends speak of Hawaii, a homeland lost to the waves, while Hawaiian chants reference Kahiki, a distant paradise now beneath the ocean. These aren't just poetic metaphors. When linguists trace the Polynesian word for homeland, Saweki, back through time, it led to Savaii in Samoa and even farther west to Java. Each migration seemed to carry the name forward like a torch, preserving the memory of lands left behind. What's striking is how these stories share a common thread: water as both destroyer and preserver. The same floods that erased settlements also fossilized their memories in myth, like insects trapped in amber. The Klamath people of North America still tell of Mount Mazama's eruption 7,700 years ago, which formed Crater Lake. Their ancestors watched the mountain collapse, yet the tale survived countless generations until geologists confirmed it in the 19th century. This isn't about proving every legend true. It's about recognizing how oral traditions encode real events in metaphorical wrappers. Like a game of telephone across millennia, details warp, but the core remains. When the Norse described the fiery end of the world in Ragnarök, were they recalling the climate chaos of the 536C volcanic winter that brought famine to Scandinavia? When the Incas warned of Unu Pachacuti, a great flood that would purge the world, did they preserve ancestral memories of El Niño's catastrophic cycles? The ocean never forgets. It simply whispers its secrets in riddles, waiting for us to listen. And sometimes the most outlandish myths turn out to be the most honest histories of all. The Hokula isn't just a replica, it's a time machine. When this double-hulled canoe first set sail from Hawaii to Tahiti in 1976, using nothing but traditional Polynesian navigation, it shattered centuries of colonial assumptions. Skeptics had dismissed oral histories of star paths and wave patterns as myth, but the Hokula's success proved otherwise. Navigator Maupiailig, trained in the old ways, guided the vessel over 2,500 miles without compass or charts, reading the ocean like his ancestors had. The stars, the swell, even the flight of birds, every detail was a clue. And when land finally appeared on the horizon, it wasn't just a triumph of seamanship, it was a resurrection of knowledge nearly erased by time. But the Hokula is just one thread in a larger tapestry of rediscovery. Geneticists tracing the DNA of sweet potatoes found across the Pacific have pinpointed their origin to the Andes, while chicken bones in Chile bear the unmistakable signature of Polynesian breeds. These aren't just academic curiosities, they're breadcrumbs left by ancient sailors, scattered across oceans and centuries. Linguistic detectives add another layer, noting how the word for kumara, sweet potato, echoes from Quechua in Peru to Maori in New Zealand, a linguistic handshake between distant shores. Experimental archaeology takes this even further. Teams have reconstructed everything from Viking longships to Egyptian reed boats, testing ancient designs in modern waters. In 2018, a crew sailed a replica Bronze Age ship from Oman to India, proving that Mesopotamian traders could have made the journey 4,000 years ago. These voyages aren't stunts, they're stress tests for history, revealing which theories hold water literally. Perhaps the most poignant rediscoveries come from indigenous communities reclaiming their maritime heritage. In Alaska, Tlingit elders collaborate with archaeologists to identify ancestral fishing sites submerged by rising seas. In the Marshall Islands, young navigators relearn stick charts from the last surviving masters. These efforts aren't just about the past, they're lifelines for cultures fighting to keep their identity afloat in a homogenized world. Technology plays an unexpected role, too. LiDAR scans have uncovered hidden causeways in Micronesia, likely ancient portage routes for canoes. Satellite imagery detects submerged settlements off India's coast, their layouts matching descriptions in Tamil Sangam poetry. Even humble tools like 3D printing help reconstruct shattered pottery from shipwrecks, revealing trade networks invisible to the naked eye. Yet for all our gadgets, the deepest insights often come from listening. When Maori oral histories described a fog-eating taniwha, a mythical creature near certain coastal caves, scientists found the spots matched microclimates where fog condenses into drinkable water, a vital waypoint for thirsty voyagers. Stories once dismissed as folklore are now recognized as encrypted survival manuals. The irony is rich. Today's high-tech tools are confirming what traditional knowledge has long held. The ocean was never empty, and the past was far more connected than we imagined. Every DNA sample, every replicated voyage, every deciphered chant pulls back another veil, showing us a world where bravery and curiosity built bridges across the blue. And the most thrilling thought, we've only just begun to read the map. The first sailors who dared to cross oceans didn't just move between points on a map, they rewired humanity's sense of the possible. Think about the Polynesian navigators who scattered breadfruit trees across thousands of miles of open Pacific, or the Phoenician traders who turned the Mediterranean into a highway of purple dye and alphabets. These weren't isolated feats of bravery, they were the first stitches in the fabric of our interconnected world. Every spice in your kitchen cabinet, every word in your language borrowed from distant shores, even the stars navigators used to steer by, they're all living echoes of those early voyages. What's astonishing isn't just how far they traveled, but how deeply they understood the world without satellites or sextants. The Viking who carved his name on a rock in Newfoundland, the Lapita potters who left their zigzag designs from Papua to Samoa, the Arab sailors who mapped the monsoon winds like clockwork, they all shared a quality modern explorers often lack: patience. Not the patience to wait for technology, but the patience to listen, to watch birds for generations until their flight paths became maps, to memorize the swell of waves until the ocean's pulse felt like a heartbeat. We've gained precision with GPS, but we've lost something vital: the art of feeling our way through the world. And here's the twist: their greatest legacy might be what they didn't do. Unlike later empires, most early ocean crossers weren't looking to conquer. The Polynesians brought taro seedlings to new islands, not weapons. The Basques kept their whaling grounds secret rather than claiming them with flags. Even Zheng, his towering treasure ships carried envoys, not armies. Their goal wasn't ownership, it was connection. That's why the sweet potato crossed the Pacific long before Columbus, why Indonesian coins turned up in Madagascar, why Norse artifacts surfaced in Inuit camps. The ocean was never empty, it was humming with unrecorded conversations. Yet for all their brilliance, these pioneers also warn us. The same currents that carried the Lapita canoes also brought rats that wiped out island birds. The trade winds that propelled the Portuguese caravels also fueled the slave trade. Exploration isn't inherently noble, it's a mirror, reflecting both our ingenuity and our flaws. Maybe that's the real lesson. Crossing an ocean doesn't just change geography, it changes us. So next time you stand on a shore, try this. Close your eyes and imagine the horizon not as an end but as a question. What would it take to follow it, not with satellites but with your senses, to navigate by the smell of rain on the wind, the angle of a seabird's shadow, the taste of salt telling you a storm is coming? That's what the first sailors mastered, not just the sea, but the art of paying attention. And in our age of constant distraction, that might be their most valuable gift. Now we're turning the conversation over to you. Which of these ancient voyages reshaped how you see the ocean? Was it the Aboriginal Australians reading clouds like maps, or the Phoenicians who allegedly sailed around Africa? Drop your thoughts below, and who knows, maybe your comment will spark someone else's journey into the past. After all, exploration doesn't end when the voyage is over. It ends when we stop asking, what's